This is a reading from An Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. Part 3rd, Rules for the Practice of Virtue. Chapter 1, The Selection of Virtues to be Practiced. The queen bee never settles in a hive without being surrounded by her swarm, and charity never takes possession of a heart without bringing in her train all other virtues, exercising and bringing them into play as a general his troops, but she does not call them forth suddenly all at once, nor in all times and places. The good man is like a tree planted by the waterside, that will bring forth its fruit in due season, because when a soul is watered by charity, it brings forth good works, seasonably and with discretion. That music which in gladness rejoices our hearts is an intrusion in the time of heaviness. There are some who make a great mistake in striving after some special virtue, by acting upon it at unsuitable times. They are like those philosophers of old who insisted on always laughing or always crying, and what is worse, such persons find fault with those who differ from them. The apostle bids us weep with them that weep, and rejoice with them that rejoice. And charity is patient, benevolent, liberal, prudent, and kind. And by the word liberal here, they mean generous. But there are some virtues of universal application, and which should infuse their own spirit into everything. We have but rarely opportunities for the practice of courage, magnanimity, and great sacrifices. But every action of our daily life should be influenced by gentleness, temperance, humility, and purity. Some qualities may be more eminent, but these are the most needful. Sugar is more agreeable than salt, but salt is in much more universal requisition. Therefore we should be rich in these everyday virtues of which we stand in such perpetual need. We ought always to give the preference to those virtues which are most incumbent on us, and not to those which are most agreeable to our inclinations. St. Paula took delight in the practice of bodily mortification, thereby enhancing her spiritual consolations. But obedience to her superior was a higher duty, and therefore St. Jerome allows that she was wrong in fasting immoderately contrary to the direction of her bishop. So the apostles who were commissioned to preach the gospel and feed the souls of men with the bread of life rightly judged that they must not forsake this duty in order to minister to the bodily needs of the poor, although in itself that was so sacred a duty. Acts chapter 6. Every station in life imposes some peculiar obligation. Different virtues are incumbent upon a bishop, a prince, or a soldier. The wife has her duties, and the widow hers. And although all should practice every virtue, still each should seek chiefly to advance in those peculiarly required by the state of life to which God has called him. Amongst those virtues not especially involved by our position, we should cultivate the most excellent rather than the most showy. Comets ordinarily appear larger than the stars and attract our eyes more, but they are not really to be compared to the stars, either in grandeur or quality, and only appear larger to us because they are so much nearer the earth, and their substance is less pure than that of the stars. In the same way, there are some virtues which approach our senses and are, so to say, material, and are therefore highly esteemed and preferred by ordinary men, who thus will exalt temporal almsgiving above spiritual or fasting, discipline and bodily mortifications above gentleness, cheerfulness, modesty, and other acts of discipline of the heart, which are in truth greatly preferable. Do you, Philothea, seek the highest virtues, not those most lauded, the best, not the most obvious, the truest and not the most showy? It is a good practice to select some particular virtue at which to aim, not neglecting the others, but in order to give regularity and method to the mind. There appeared once to St. John, Bishop of Alexandria, a beautiful virgin, arrayed in royal robes, shining brighter than the sun, and crowned with an olive wreath. She spoke to him, saying, I am the king's eldest daughter, and if thou wilt make me thy friend, I will lead thee into his presence. Then he knew that this was God himself teaching him to have mercy upon Christ's poor, and from that time he devoted himself to the practice of that virtue, so that he has always been known as St. John the Almoner. Eulogius the Alexandrian, seeking specially to dedicate himself to God, and not having resolution either to embrace the solitary life or perpetual obedience, brought a wretched, diseased man into his house, as an occasion for practicing charity and mortification, vowing to serve and honor him as a servant, his Lord. After a while, both parties being disposed to separate, they referred their case to St. Anthony the Great, who replied, "Beware, my sons, that you part not, having so nearly approached the end of your journey. For if the angel of death does not find you together, both are in danger of losing their crowns." The king, St. Louis, regularly visited his hospitals and ministered with his own hands to the sick. St. Francis loved poverty above all things, calling her his bride. St. Dominic specially devoted himself to preaching, and hence the name of the order of preachers. St. Gregory the Great took great delight in welcoming pilgrims, therein imitating the patriarch Abraham, and like him receiving the King of Glory under a pilgrim's form. Tobias adopted the charitable habit of burying the dead. St. Elizabeth loved to set aside her royal independence by the entire subjection of herself and her whole will. When St. Catherine of Genoa became a widow, she devoted herself to serving in the hospital. Cassian relates how a certain devout woman, desiring to practice the virtue of patience, had recourse to St. Athanasius, who assigned to her as a companion a poor widow of a fretful, irritable, passionate temper, who, rendering herself almost insupportable to the pious maiden, afforded her ample scope for the practice of forbearance and gentleness. So, amongst the servants of God, some have devoted themselves to tending the sick, some to visiting the poor, others to the advancement of Christ's religion amongst little children, others to the restoration of lost and wandering souls, some to the especial care of the church and altars, others to the promotion of peace and concord amongst men, thus resembling embroiderers who work their gold, silver, and silk onto various materials, thereby producing all manner of beautiful flowers. For these pious souls who adopt some especial practice of devotion use it as the groundwork whereon they embroider countless other virtues, thus regulating and giving method to all their good works and affections by means of this their chief objective, and arraying their soul in a vesture of gold, wrought about with diverse colors. If we are hindered by some particular vice, we should, as far as possible, strive to cultivate the opposite virtue, making all things tend to it, for by this means we shall subdue the enemy, and not cease to advance in all virtue. If I am especially tempted with pride or anger, I must, above all things, seek to practice humility and gentleness, and call in all my other devout acts of prayer the sacraments, prudence, perseverance, and temperance to my aid. For even as the wild boar whets his tusks by the help of his other teeth, thereby sharpening them also, so the good man who seeks to perfect himself in that virtue of which he stands most in need should whet and sharpen it by the practice of other virtues, which will thus themselves become stronger and brighter. So it was with Job, who, whilst specially seeking to learn patience under temptation, became very holy and grounded in all other goodness. And St. Gregory Nazianzen says that by the help of one virtue heartily practiced, man may attain to all holiness, instancing Rahab, who, having practiced the duty of hospitality, received such glory of God. But for this we require great devotion and exceeding fervor and charity. Chapter 2. Choice of virtues continued. St. Augustine says well that when men are beginning to lead a devout life, they commit errors which are, strictly speaking, against the laws of perfection, but which nevertheless are valuable as indications of future piety, to which they often conduce not a little. The low, groveling fear whence arises over scrupulousness in the minds of those who are but just forsaking sin is a quality not to be despised, inasmuch as it is the forerunner of future purity of conscience. But the same feeling would be blamable in those further advanced in holiness, whose hearts should be filled with love, which will gradually banish such servile fear. Originally, St. Bernard was exceedingly severe and rigorous towards those whom he directed, telling them when they came to him to leave their bodies and come with the Spirit only. Hearing their confession, he treated all, even the least fault, with such severity, and so pressed his poor novices in perfection, that instead of urging them forward, he kept them back, for they were dismayed and discouraged at being thus rudely driven up so steep and rugged a path. This was the result of the saint's own ardent zeal and great purity, and zeal is assuredly a virtue, yet in this case it became an evil. But God vouchsafed to correct it, filling St. Bernard's heart with gentleness, tenderness, and mildness, so that changing his whole system, he reproached himself bitterly with his former exacting severity, and became so tender and forbearing that he was like St. Paul, all things to all men, that he might gain them all. St. Jerome records of his beloved daughter in the faith, St. Paula, that she not only was extravagant in her bodily mortifications, but also self-willed in persisting in them, contrary to the advice of St. Epiphanius, her bishop, and further, that at the death of those she loved, she indulged in such excessive grief as to endanger her own life. It will be said, he continues, that instead of praising this holy woman, I am condemning her, but I call Jesus, her master and mine, to witness that I speak the whole truth, both good and bad, representing her as she really was, according as one Christian should write of another. That is to say, I write her memoir, not her panegyric, and truly her faults would be another's virtues. That is to say, that St. Paula's faults and imperfections would have counted as virtues in one less holy, and indeed there are many actions which we hold as imperfections in the perfect, which in the imperfect would pass for great virtues. It is a good sign when the legs of one recovering from sickness begin to swell, as denoting that reviving nature is throwing out what is corrupt in the system. But in a healthy man it would be a bad sign, indicating that nature had not strength to absorb her own superfluities. Philothea, we must esteem highly those who abound in virtues, even though mingled with imperfections, remembering that so it has been with saints. But for ourselves, we must practice all virtues faithfully and watchfully, and give good heed to the wise man's counsel, and not rely on our own wisdom, but on that of the guides God has given us. There are some things which pass current as virtues, but are really quite otherwise, such as ecstasies, raptures, insensibilities, impassibilities, deific unions, elevations, transformations, and similar perfections, which are the subject of certain books. These promise to exalt the soul to a purely intellectual contemplation, to an essential application of the Spirit, and to supereminent life. But these are not virtues. They are rather the reward of those virtues, or foretastes of the bliss of a future existence, which are sometimes granted to men in order to kindle their longings for the perfect blessedness of paradise. But it is safer not to seek such favors, which are no ways necessary in order to serve and love God truly, which should be our only aim. Neither, indeed, can they be obtained by a labored search, since they are rather emotions than actions, which we can receive but not originate. Our aim is to become good, devout, pious men and women, and to that end we must labor. Then, if it should please God to give us angelic perfections, we should doubtless be good angels. But meanwhile, let us simply, humbly, and devoutly practice those lowly virtues, the acquisition of which has been appointed by our Savior as our daily task, such as patience, cheerfulness, a mortified heart, humility, obedience, poverty, chastity, kindness towards our neighbor, forbearance towards his faults, diligence, and holy fervor. Let us cheerfully leave preeminent graces to preeminent souls. We do not deserve so high a post in God's service. Too happy if we can obtain the humblest office in his household, whence he in his own good time, if he sees fit, will bid us come up higher. Yes, Philothea, this glorious king does not reward his servants according to the dignity of their office, but according to the humility and love with which they fulfill that appointed them. Whilst Saul sought his father's asses, he found the kingdom of Israel. Rebekah, whilst watering Abraham's camels, became his son's bride. Ruth, gleaning after the reapers and lying at Boaz's feet, was raised up to be his wife. Undoubtedly, high pretensions are very liable to illusions, deceits, and errors, so that sometimes those who would fain be angels are not really even good men, and there is more of elevation and holiness in their words and expressions than in their heart and deeds. Nevertheless, we should never be hasty with our contempt or censure, but whilst we thank God for the exalted favors he bestows on others, remain humbly in our own lower sphere, lower indeed, but safer and better, more suited to our weakness and insufficiency, certain that if we walk therein humbly and faithfully, God will exalt us to real greatness.